welcome to the webinar. Thanks for attending. This is the Smoke-Free Outdoor Area Equitable Enforcement webinar hosted by the Public Health Law Center and presented by my colleague, Jamie Long. We are the Law and Policy Partnership, which is a joint initiative of the American Lung Association and PHLC. We provide free legal technical assistance, research, training, and analysis to help communities pass strong ordinances that are both effective and sound in the work to end the commercial tobacco epidemic in California. The Public Health Law Center is located at Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota. We acknowledge that we are in the indigenous homelands of the Dakota people, also known as the Sioux Nation, and that 4 federally recognized Dakota tribal nations remain in the area. The region is also shared territory with the Anishinaabe, and also known as the Ojibwe or Chippewa, and the Ho-Chunk Nation also has a historic relationship to the region. We appreciate the ongoing stewardship, spiritual connections, and lifeways developed in these homelands upon which this law school sits. Our goal is policy that improves public health. This means taking into account the social determinants of health, adverse childhood experiences, and inequity in general. We consider it our responsibility to use our legal knowledge to bring justice to public health as we support our partners in reducing health disparities. Relatedly, I also want to acknowledge the difference between traditional and commercial tobacco. Throughout this presentation, Mr. Long or Jamie Long will refer to the environmental impacts of tobacco. But I want to clarify that when he is talking specifically about industrial scale commercial tobacco production, he will not be talking about traditional tobacco, as it is still used religiously, medicinally, and ceremoniously in many different cultures. The Public Health Law Center offers free legal technical assistance to communities, public health advocates, and other partners. We also publish on important issues pertaining to commercial tobacco control, and we offer trainings and webinars. What we don't do is offer direct legal representation, nor do we lobby. Without further ado, I will turn this over to my colleague, Jamie Long, who's doing this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Good to be with everyone today. So we're going to be talking today about smoke-free outdoor policies and equitable enforcement. Before we get to the enforcement, thought it would be helpful to set the context for why local jurisdictions may want to adopt smoke-free outdoor policies in the first place. And the primary reason, of course, is public health. Secondhand smoke, as we all know, is a toxic contaminant. And in fact, in 2006, the California Air Resources Board identified secondhand smoke in the same category as the most toxic automotive and industrial air pollutants, and a serious threat for which there is no safe level of exposure. We also know that smoke-free outdoor policies can help those trying to quit by reducing the temptation to smoke when there is not smoking prevalence around them, and reducing the areas in which smoking is allowed. We also know that smoke-free outdoor policies send a message about social acceptability, and this can be particularly impactful for youth and cigarette and other tobacco product initiation if it's demonstrated that society does not view tobacco use as acceptable. We also know that for electronic cigarettes, evidence continues to build that exposure to electronic smoking device aerosol, including secondhand exposure, has immediate impacts on the human respiratory and cardiovascular systems and poses a risk to human health. Another reason that jurisdictions may choose to adopt smoke-free outdoor policies are environmental. We know that cigarette butts are the #1 littered item in the world, and these filters on cigarettes are made of the plastic material cellulose acetate, which breaks down into microplastics, and that can move deep into the food chain, into our water supply, and can harm wildlife, harm our waterways, and harm our soils. And the products that are often leached out of cigarette butts include nicotine, arsenic, and lead, to name just a few. Electronic cigarette waste, too, is very harmful, can leach products such as nicotine, benzene, formaldehyde, and lead, not to mention that the batteries in electronic cigarettes are themselves flammable and have been described in the past as potentially having the ability to turn into flaming rockets. So lots of reasons to be concerned about the environmental impacts of both of these products. Fire risk is also a reason of its own right why jurisdictions may choose to adopt smoke-free outdoor policies, and a staggering 38 California wildfires each year are started by the disposal of cigarette butts. So that's one of the reasons why 235 and counting California cities and counties have adopted smoke-free outdoor policies. And these policies can cover areas like parks, recreational areas, but also outdoor workplaces, restaurants and bars, or even public events. And this image here is the partnership's smoke and tobacco-free outdoor area model ordinance. We won't be talking about the ordinance in much detail today, but that is the basis on which a lot of the enforcement policies that we're going to be discussing is built. And we are, of course, stand ready to assist any jurisdiction who wants to adopt a new smoke and tobacco-free outdoor area ordinance. So why are we talking about equitable enforcement today? Well, enforcement is important for all the reasons we just mentioned, which is that we want to make sure that we're protecting public health. We want to make sure that we're protecting the environment. We want to make sure we're reducing fire risk. And if a policy is not enforced, then we're likely not going to get those outcomes. But we also want to make sure we're balancing the goal of protecting the public with the knowledge that punitive measures themselves are unlikely to help those who are struggling with tobacco addiction to end their tobacco use. Research tells us that the best approach to help those confronting tobacco addiction is a combination of counseling, education, and nicotine replacement therapies. It's also important to consider how smoke-free or tobacco-free outdoor air policies might impact people experiencing homelessness, how feasible a particular enforcement approach might be as well, and also who will be enforcing a particular policy. This could vary depending on the jurisdiction, their resources, their size, their local preferences. It can depend on the type of policy that you're trying to enforce, what the scope is of the outdoor area smoke-free policy that you're applying. And it could also raise the question of who would result in the fewest potential negative collateral consequences as an enforcement body. So, for example, code enforcement might be an option for a local jurisdiction having a civil enforcer, whether that's a local public health department or perhaps even local park officials. Business owners could be a good tool for enforcement, particularly on private properties such as a restaurant, an event space, or a private recreation area. City or county attorneys could be good options for enforcing, bringing particular legal action against individual violators. The public is an option for enforcing, and we'll get into that a little bit more. And police are another option for enforcement as well. In general, the partnership recommends prioritizing non-law enforcement interactions when possible, such as starting with other civil public employees like recreation center staff or business owners before involving law enforcement to enforce. So, for example, our model policy focuses primary responsibility for enforcement on property owners by holding them accountable with appropriate civil penalties for their failures to enforce the rules required under the law. But before you get to enforcement, the primary area you want to start with is education. That's because education is often less expensive and more effective at achieving results. And the goal of any policy should be to try to get self-enforcement as high as possible. Most people in your jurisdiction will not smoke if they're aware of the policy, particularly if they see signage that is clear and posted around the areas. So there will be greater community compliance if the policy is easy to understand, if members of the public know what is expected of them. This also includes making sure that the areas are clearly identified where smoking is permitted and where it is not, so there's no confusion by the public. Informing the public and local businesses is also very important. You want to make sure that, particularly with a new policy, as it's going into effect, that there is public education, that individuals aren't getting enforcement actions for policies that they're unaware of whenever possible. And you also want to make sure that the policy is fair and applies to everyone. So a couple of examples of signage that can be used, particularly in parks. The one on the left includes both cigarette smoke, tobacco, but also mentions smokeless tobacco, e-cigarettes, and vaping. So this is a good way to make sure to include for those jurisdictions that have tobacco-free policies that you're making clear that you are including all a range of tobacco products. The sign on the right also has tobacco-free. You can see in the little small red circle that it includes vape products and includes smokeless tobacco. The reason I included this sign is it also has a quit line on it. So one option that jurisdictions may want to consider with their signage is to have a cessation hotline or other cessation information on the signage to encourage members of the public to seek help for tobacco dependency. So potential language to promote this could be in a particular ordinance to require that at least one sign placed in each place where smoking was prohibited include a cessation hotline number, for example. Also, oftentimes it might be helpful to include a number for individuals to register complaints. And that can be a way to help with public enforcement, help with notifying individuals if there are violations taking place in a public space. So an ordinance, for example, could require that signs include a phone number for complaints be included conspicuously on the sign. Also important is to make sure that the signage reflects the policy. So if you're, as was mentioned, if your policy is tobacco-free, you want to make sure it's not just a cigarette that's on the sign. You want to make clear that there's also vaping products or other products either listed in writing or made clear pictorially. So now we're going to get into our publication that we just put out in August, which is the Smoke-Free Outdoor Areas Enforcement Guide. And so this is intended for California communities that are either have adopted or are ready to adopt smoke-free outdoor area policy. And it walks through enforcement options, and we are in this publication trying to help local jurisdictions make decisions for themselves about which options they might want to include in their policies or remove from their policies, and do so through a lens of equity. We worked in close partnership with the California Tobacco Control Program to do work on the back end to make sure that we went through an extensive comment and revision process with many statewide and local stakeholders as we were pulling this publication together. And the goal here is for jurisdictions to be able to have multiple potentially overlapping enforcement mechanisms in an ordinance, which will help increase the likelihood of compliance and in turn protect the public from secondhand smoke. So we have a color coding system that we tried to make this easy for folks with this publication. And we will have 2 other additional webinars coming in the next 2 weeks on the companion publications to this, focusing on tobacco retail licensing and on smoke-free multi-unit housing. We've used the same system across each of the publications, where we have green for most preferred or most equitable, yellow for proceed with caution, and red for not recommended by the partnership. So let's dive in. So the first green policy that we recommend are civil penalties against property owners. As I mentioned, holding private property owners accountable for failure to enforce an ordinance can be a really effective tool and can limit potential negative consequences of fines or criminal enforcement against individuals. If the penalty, for example, is that a property owner is not allowing an individual to eat at their restaurant if they're smoking outdoors when that's against the policy. And requiring property owners, you can also have graduated enforcement requirements for the property owners. So, for example, requiring that they make a first request that an individual stop smoking before they enforce. That could apply to both private property owners or as well to civil staff in other contexts, and can ask violators to leave if they don't comply. So these can be really effective ways to help motivate compliance of individuals. The cautions are private property owners may resist being put in the role of enforcing, and so there could be some tension there. Would potentially be worth engaging with restaurant community, local recreation center private owners or the like event owners on these policies as well. And so if there's not strong buy-in from those individuals, then there may be poor compliance from property owners. The second option to discuss is community service. So this can be set up as an alternative to civil fines, and community service can often limit the financial hardship on individuals, and also potentially could be tailored to focus the community service efforts on tobacco cessation or tobacco waste cleanup efforts. So, for example, if an individual is caught violating a secondhand smoking policy in a park, they may be asked to do an hour of community service helping clean up tobacco waste in the park itself. That would be a pretty clear connection for those individuals, and a way to help draw a correlation between the activity and the punishment. Some of the cautions are that community service can still pose a financial hardship to some. For instance, if you're required to miss work or arrange for childcare, so having some flexibility on setting up a community service timing could be important. If the community service is enforced by police, this may open the door to other collateral consequences, which we'll get into a little bit later. And if you don't have a community service program set up, then you may have to invest in some new resources or programming. A third green option to consider is nuisance. So a public nuisance is a legal doctrine that applies when a person unreasonably interferes with a right that the general public shares in common. So local ordinances can declare violations of smoke-free ordinances to be a public nuisance, which can open up this enforcement option. And most local jurisdictions will have well-developed nuisance procedures and a nuisance ordinance that can be referenced in any smoke-free or tobacco-free outdoor air ordinance. So the benefits of this is that nuisance abatement tools are commonly used by local jurisdictions like cities or counties attorneys. They set up options like restraining orders or preliminary or permanent injunctions for individuals who are repeat offenders. But one caution is that it may require more local resources than a particular jurisdiction has on hand. And depending on how it is enforced, there could be some concerns about inequitable enforcement or collateral consequences if it's used to seek fines. So we're going to move now to our yellow category, the proceed with caution. So first is civil fines against tobacco users. So we do include monetary administrative penalties in our model policy, but we do acknowledge that they can carry some risks. And so we're going to walk through the benefits and risks here. So benefits, civil public employees, for example, like recreation center staff, can be charged with enforcing civil fines often. And so that can remove the potential collateral consequences from police or a criminal enforcement option. When you're also relying on recreation center or other public staff to the extent that that's available in your community, oftentimes they will be more decentralized. So, might be located in the recreation center, for example, where the smoke-free policy is taking effect. So they may be in the best position to observe non-compliance with the policy and to enforce it. You can also partner civil fines with something like community service as an alternative to paying the fine, give individuals, for example, a choice between a civil fine or community service. The caution is that you might have some new duties that you're asking your employees to do. And so they may not necessarily, these may not be duties that they're doing or performing right now. So it's an additional task. There may be some resistance to serving in an enforcement role if city or county staff in a civil capacity hasn't done that before. And depending on the residents' financial circumstances, it could impose financial hardship for them. There's also a risk of discriminatory or unequal enforcement when you have individuals who are enforcing policies like this. And that can be a challenge for a community and something that local communities may be concerned about or may want to address. Also, there's a chance that unpaid civil fines could lead to later misdemeanor charges or even warrants in some jurisdictions. And so there could be some additional collateral consequences even from a civil penalty. The second yellow option we'll talk about is ejection. So this would be removing an individual from the location where they are committing the violation. So this can be a strong motivator to comply. An example might be a concert where you have a smoke-free outdoor venue If you're getting ejected from a concert you really wanted to go to, then that can be a pretty strong motivator to comply, or from a restaurant or other outdoor area. There are also, similarly with the restaurant enforcement from the private business owner, you can incorporate a graduated enforcement. So you can require, as we do in our model policy, that there must be a request to comply by public employees, if that's who's enforcing this, before any ejection occurs. So they at least get one warning before they are kicked out. Some of the cautions line up closely with the enforcement discussion before. Public staff may not be used to these roles. If there's private property owners, they may not have strong incentive to buy in or there may be poor compliance if they aren't bought into the policy. And there are some potential as well, in particular with ejection, for thinking about people experiencing homelessness and how this might apply to a park setting. And I'll talk about that a little more in a second. And there could be also some potential displacement from an individual's current home if they are residing in a park and there is enforcement of an ejection policy against them. So I want to talk a little bit about individuals experiencing homelessness and how that might be thought about in these policies. This is a publication that we put out about 4 years ago, talking about tobacco addiction for the unhoused population. And this publication speaks mainly to the context of shelters and how to think through tobacco policies in those contexts, but it does provide some helpful information about the unhoused population in general and how people experiencing homelessness are confronted with the problems of tobacco dependency. And homeless individuals, as you might imagine, often face clinical, logistical challenges and others that make them particularly susceptible to tobacco use and to chemical dependency treatment. To chemical dependency. About 20 to 30% of unhoused adults have a serious mental illness, which often contributes to tobacco dependency. And at least 70% of all housed individuals in the US smoke, about 4 times that of the general US population. Smoking is often seen as a way to cope with the stress, boredom, and tension of living in survival mode day after day. But that doesn't mean that unhoused individuals want to keep smoking. In a survey of over 200 homeless adults at 9 homeless shelters, researchers found a smoking prevalence of about 70%. But of these smokers, 72% had attempted to quit at least once, and almost 40% said they were ready to quit within the next 6 months. Unfortunately, though, even though many try repeatedly to quit, the success rates are often lower than in the general population. So what does this mean for thinking about enforcement? Well, one is to the extent that a jurisdiction can help with providing tobacco dependency referrals or information or treatment, that can be particularly important for those experiencing homelessness. But it also is something that each individual jurisdiction will potentially want to think about, and how they want to approach enforcement or approach particularly considerations around civil penalties or ejection, whether those are appropriate for their community and how they might interact with their unhoused population. So finally, we're going to get into the 2 categories that we do not recommend for enforcement. And the first of these is the private right of action. We don't include a private lawsuit enforcement option in our model policy. So this would be deputizing the public to bring a civil action against an individual who is violating the policy. And we view this as creating a large risk of discriminatory or unequal enforcement. Also, the harm to a single individual of a single interaction may not be severe enough to merit the involvement of the court system and may burden the judicial system. We also, are worried that sometimes litigants are going to struggle to prove smoking occurred, and so it could set up a bit of a false promise to have this type of an approach. So we don't recommend including a private right of action. And finally, we don't recommend including criminal enforcement. And there are significant equity concerns with criminal penalties. For instance, racial profiling and discriminatory racial patterns are well documented, and the enforcement of many crimes, including for lower level offenses. And another consideration is that the criminal process may trigger a probation or parole violation, or a summons that could create a criminal record or a warrant, or other significant ripple effects within individuals' interaction with the justice system. In turn, these criminal sanctions could jeopardize an individual's housing, benefits, education, or employment. So for these reasons, we don't include criminal enforcement in our model policy. And just to zoom out a little bit on what collateral consequences might look like, this was a chart put together by the Government Accountability Office, and it's in the context of nonviolent drug convictions, but I think it has important parallels to thinking about criminal enforcement, even in the tobacco context. So the Government Accountability Office was charged with putting together a list of all of the federal collateral consequences for nonviolent drug convictions. They counted 641, and those ranged from all of the different categories that are on here: employment, education, housing, occupational licenses, political participation, to name a few. So there are some significant consequences for criminal enforcement often. And so those are worth thinking about when putting together an enforcement policy and trying to make sure that it is achieving equity, both having the outcomes we want with improving public health, but also not trying to criminalize individuals who are struggling with nicotine addiction, and making sure that they are getting the best support possible to get back on the path to quitting for those who want to, or at least not engaging in tobacco use in a public space where it could be impacting other people. So with that, this is our contact information. And I know we're going to take questions now, but before I forget, I just want to mention that we're going to put a needs assessment survey in the chat. And for those who are able, would really appreciate if you could fill out the survey so that we have a sense for what some of the biggest needs in California are for making sure we're providing the help that you're looking for. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Rachel for questions.
Hi, thanks, Jamie. We also have another person who's fielding questions and answers as well. And I would like to take that moment to introduce Jenna Grosser, who is a senior program consultant with CTCP.
Jenna, would you like to
sorry, go ahead.
Make any comments based on the presentation before we get into questions?
Well, sure. I just briefly, I'm so appreciative that Public Health Law Center kind of took on this task. This is something CTCP has been talking about for quite a while now, and really trying to find a way to lay out these options so that this is a conversation that we are having, not just amongst ourselves or the agencies that might be passing the policies, but really our community, to ensure that we're thinking about equity and justice and putting those front and center through the community's lens, and how important that becomes. So happy to answer questions and say anything else.
All right. One of the questions that we had come in, I believe, was, will enforcement cost the county money? There is no funds for staff to enforce, and who would enforce a policy for an ordinance such as this? And Jamie, if you would like to address that question first, and then Jenna, if anything comes to mind, feel free to chime in after Jamie responds.
Great. Thanks for that question. Yes, resources are certainly an important factor in thinking about enforcement options. And that was one of the reasons we wanted to provide a big range of options that jurisdictions could consider. Some of these options are going to take more local resources than others. So for example, if you're relying on private enforcement and trying to encourage local business owners or recreational center operators to enforce the policy, that shouldn't take very much resources on your end. Of course, you may need to enforce against those individuals to make sure they're they're doing the job. But that's not going to be as much staff time as if it was a direct enforcement option for the jurisdiction. And in terms of who will enforce, talked a little bit about those, the different options that jurisdictions have, and certainly that can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. We know that in some areas, police are really the only enforcement option. We know that in others, larger jurisdictions, for example, they might have a robust civil enforcement section. And so I think that can vary depending on your local needs, and we're ready to help with jurisdictions think through those choices and provide individualized support as needed.
I think I would add one of the things to keep in mind is that the more comprehensive your policy is, the more likely it is that enforcement gets easier without having sort of like the authorities to look in on everybody. Oftentimes what we've seen in the past is like if you're just working on an outdoor dining policy, but you haven't also made sidewalks smoke-free, there becomes an enforcement issue because sidewalks and outdoor dining spaces are often connected, or with parks and playgrounds and other outdoor spaces, right? The more comprehensive you go, the less work there is for an enforcement agency that you would have to choose to do, because people generally know the policy. The policy is so well known. If you do all the education and you have all of that planned right, that it feels less necessary. So I would just make that plug for thinking about being really comprehensive in your outdoor smoke-free efforts for that reason, and many others.
And one point I think also works well is for enforcement. Signs do a lot of work for you. And so sometimes just having a sign posted in those spaces, the persons who are rule followers are going to see it and respond that way. And that'll deal with a majority of some of those enforcement concerns in general. It's just having posted signs of what you can do in what spaces and what you can't. There is another question that kind of hits in on something, Jamie, you addressed, which is, can these guides be inclusive of rural areas?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And we did, when we were putting this together, solicit a lot of feedback from rural communities and some of our rural stakeholders. And they expressed that some of these options aren't going to work in every jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions aren't going to have the resources to pursue setting up a community service program, for example, potentially, or some of the other possible options that we presented. So we certainly understand that, and this isn't meant to be a one-size-fits-all. It's meant to be a policy list, but just to try to get jurisdictions thinking about what the different approaches they might want to take are and how those could be viewed through an equity lens. But certainly we recognize that every jurisdiction is going to have unique needs.
Another question that we had just come in, has tobacco product waste motivated jurisdictions to adopt smoke-free outdoor area policies? And Jamie and Jenna, I'll have both of you kind of address this. Jamie, if you wouldn't mind tackling that first, though.
Yeah, I love this question. So yes is the answer. We did a webinar just a few weeks ago on our tobacco product waste toolkit that we've released, and this is an increasing concern for a lot of jurisdictions, and the smoke-free outdoor area policies overlap a lot with those concerns, as we mentioned. So we have had jurisdictions that want to work in this space and who are particularly concerned about tobacco product waste. A lot of our coastal communities have pursued this in particular because of concerns about ocean health and beach health. And then I think the wildfire concern has contributed a lot on the waste side as well. So we did the last webinar with the Sierra Club as our co-presenters, who are very active in this space and concerned about the environmental impacts. And happy to kick it to Jenna for her observations.
I mean, I think Jamie really nailed it. I do think the more that you're able to show that tobacco waste is an issue in your community, the more that your community is able to showcase that problem exists. I also think it's really important to be thinking about evaluation and showing how your outdoor policies might reduce that problem. It really, the statewide Parks and Beaches bill Just three times that bill came around and got vetoed and finally got signed back in 2019. But that was a lot of work and effort to show that tobacco waste is such a problem in our parks and beaches. So I think the more that you're able to demonstrate the problem, the more helpful it's going to be for you to get the more comprehensive policies. So just, I think, really be doing that work, showcasing it, whether it's, from litter cleanups to evaluation, make sure you're capturing those stories. But yeah, I agree. I think communities are very motivated by it.
This next question kind of piggybacks off of the rural communities and resources that rural communities have. And essentially the question goes along the lines of how can a rural community consider enforcement specifically when they have those more limited resources? What would be some enforcement options for addressing and enforcing this model policy? Jamie.
Maybe I'll let Jenna go first.
Jenna first.
It's a really great question and a great point. I think if you know me at all, my answer is almost always going to start at the community level. Your community is best aware, has the best knowledge of what its resources are. So if you're using these documents for like the one presented in today's webinar, the ones in the upcoming webinars, have that conversation. What resources do exist to help enforcement? Really come at it from that approach of like, okay, so let's build this around. These documents are guides. They're not meant to be the full solution. But if you put a bunch of brains together, people who know their community really well, enforcement will come about. And I think that's really essential for rural areas. As was noted earlier, like there's no hard and fast rule about who the enforcement agency is going to be or how it gets enforced. Signage is incredibly effective. There are ways to assist with that using your funds. But it might be like the one thing that you're asking the community to pitch in for, the government to pitch in for. If you can get the signage done and then really just hone in on that implementation, that education around what the policy is. Most people want to be rule followers. They like to get the A, they like to get the good grade. They don't want to be seen doing the wrong thing. So it's incredibly effective, but your community likely has the solution. The other thing I would encourage is that sometimes we feel like in both, I think in rural and urban areas, I've heard this story time and again, where it's like, well, the partners who are going to be impacted by this. So for example, maybe you're fearful of approaching a partner who works with the unhoused community because you think they're going to hate this policy. Like this is going to affect people who are in parks and we don't want the police engaging with them and whatnot. Almost every single time when you engage those partners and you say, we're trying to solve this problem, can you help us think through the solution? The solution will be the equitable and just thing that your community needs. So don't expect that you yourself are going to have the answer. If you haven't gone out and talked to your community first and figured out what the solution for enforcement could be, that your solution is in there. You just got to do that work.
That was a fantastic answer, Jenna. Jimmy, I don't even need you to tackle that since she hit that out of the park. I have another question though that came in, which was, how can we create model language that ensures that tobacco users who violate a smoke-free bar patio policy are not bothered by the enforcement agency, but instead the bar staff, if anyone speaks to them? And then also, how specific can we be about the signage in the policy? For instance, what is the exact location the language utilized to ensure that the policy requires vigorous signage? Jamie, I'll let you address this one first, and Jenna, if you have any other comments.
Yeah, those are great questions. So definitely having the primary enforcement responsibility land on in the laps of the private bar or restaurant owner is something we recommend. It's what we started with. And you can write the policy so that is the primary tool of enforcement, is having those individuals approach them. And as was mentioned, you can also have it be graduated. So they got to give them a warning before they kick them out, give them a chance to comply. But we found that is the best approach. And then having back-end enforcement with the restaurant or bar owner. So for example, if there are complaints that, well, we've had customers say that your back patio is not complying and there's a lot of smoking going on. That can be done on the back end. It doesn't necessarily have to be done in the moment, right? You don't have to catch somebody in the act and have an individual local enforcement official come into the bar or restaurant. So you can respond to public complaints or public reports that a bar or restaurant is not complying. And then the other signage question is a great one, and you can be very specific in the way you draft signage requirements in ordinances. Some signage ordinances have the font size that is required on there, so that is one area that there's a lot of ability to be specific about where you want the signs to be, what you want the content to be on there, and that can be something that can be tailored to each individual jurisdiction and made to fit your needs.
Jenna, do you have any thoughts on the policy on signage, or also on anything else addressed in that question?
Again, I think Jamie did a really good job with that. I think education, again, goes a long way. I think it helps to have a policy on the books when you're trying to do something voluntary, so that like the wait staff at a restaurant can say, I'm sorry, this is a law. Like, it's not my fault. I'm not trying to be rude or cause a kerfuffle here, but like, it's helpful when they have something they can point to. So in that, you're doing, them a favor. So I do think it makes it easier to be able to blame the city law, if you will. So something to keep in, I think that's something to keep in mind. It feels like a burden when people are trying to enforce something that's voluntary, but this is why these laws can help. Yeah, and I think signage keeps people pretty well enforced. If not, I've seen a good number of small children who yell fire or smoking when they smell somebody smoking. But like the whole point of it is to try to create a community with expectations for a smoke-free, tobacco-free world. And so if you've got those signs up and you're doing the education that you need to be, the expectation exists, and anybody who's trying to do that is breaking a new social norm. And that's our whole goal, is changing the social norms. So
thank you for that. There's another question that we had come in. We're very concerned about the targeting of unhoused persons in our community. How can we avoid that? Jenna, do you want to tackle this one first, and then Jamie, any comments additional afterwards?
I do. How do we avoid targeting homeless individuals in our communities? We talk to the community organizations that work with homeless individuals. Work with those who are working with homeless individuals to figure out how to make your policy most equitable, most enforceable, and without having that negative impact. Be forward thinking in terms of, how is your city council or your board of supervisors handling homeless individuals? Like, make that a part of the research that you're doing, so that if there might be unintended negative consequences that could come up in your approach. Knowing how your council feels, how they react, how they treat homeless individuals is incredibly important, because you need to be, for housing, for really all of our, just everything that we do. I think that's really important. But the primary thing you can do is engage the community working with them. If you tell the community there's a problem, the community will want to help you solve them, but you have to get them to the table.
I think that's a great answer. And two additional thoughts. One is that there's a lot of room for creativity in how you write enforcement policies. Jurisdictions are going to approach their local unhoused populations with different rules, with different approaches. Some may have designated areas where it's okay for folks to reside, set up tents, etc. Some may not, right? So there are lots of individual needs and circumstances that you can craft policy around. And we do that all the time, where we hear from an individual jurisdiction and they say, can you help us do this? And we say, well, sure, it hasn't been tried before, but doesn't mean we can't try it now. And so I think Jenna's point is spot on, that you can find answers to some of these problems. And certainly this is one of the trickier ones, but hopefully the presentation that I brief description of the homeless population that I mentioned, a lot of these folks are not do not want to keep using tobacco. They prefer to see if they can get help for cessation. And so there may be some win-wins there where you can try to talk with the communities, groups that are working with the homeless population and see if there are ways to support tobacco cessation efforts, both with individual members and then potentially even as the publication we have out goes into with homeless shelters or some other residences too.
Can I add to just emphasize what Amy just said a little bit, how important that cessation is? It is that cessation efforts are part of your enforcement plan. Your enforcement plan should be incredibly comprehensive in thinking through. Again, our CTCP funded projects don't get to do enforcement, right? But we do get to think about it. We do get to put the recommendations forward, to talk to the city, to talk to the county about what it is that it looks like. And cessation needs to be at the forefront. So if you are concerned about an outdoor smoke-free policy impacting folks who don't have access to those resources, how can you creatively be working with your community to make sure they do? For example, one example that I really love dealing with unhoused populations is trying to get like the Kick It California app onto the cell phones that organizations often give out to those who are experiencing homelessness, but still need to connect with a resource, a counselor, somebody in the community as they're trying to get their access their benefits, right? Like that's an easy thing to have a discussion about that you can work with in your community. So like get creative, but make sure cessation is such a big part of the conversation you're having. It's something that we can offer. We have resources that are free. I think that makes it I don't know, chef's kiss, cherry on top. It should be the thing that is there and a part of this conversation.
One thing that I would also add to, and this is just coming from my experience as a former public defender for quite some time. One of the ways if you're concerned about targeting, criminal convictions are often a vehicle utilized by law enforcement to go after certain persons that they've had repeated issues with, for instance, sometimes unhoused populations. And so it's a reason why when Jamie was going through the presentation and talking about there are things that are not recommended, if you are concerned about your unhoused population, the criminal convictions, the citations, these are ways that generate and sustain inequitable structures for unhoused persons to, one, be caught up in the system, to potentially get warrants for getting citations for criminal charges for violating these ordinances. And so if the concern is about the targeting and creating a hostile living space for unhoused persons, finding ways that support and acknowledge that equity means maybe taking it out of the criminal realm is important as well. So, and then there's another question that came in. We are advocating for 100% smoke and tobacco-free policy at a large regional park, and we are in need of assistance for best practices and examples of equitable methods of enforcement in this area. Jamie, if you would like to address that, and Jenna, if any other comments come.
Reach out to us. We can help. we got a model policy, of course, but we only put that out as a guide, and we love providing individual technical legal assistance and making sure that we're crafting an ordinance that works for your community. So please get in touch.
I'd add observation data, like really understand what it is. If you were to use the exact model, what would that look like in your community? Are there places where it doesn't work? Or are there places where it does work? Is it enough? Is it not enough? The model is a place to start, but like Jamie said, everything can be tailored to the specific needs of your community. So often, especially with our programs, we work in a central city, right? So I live in Sacramento, and I can tell you a lot about Sacramento, but I can't tell you about the surrounding cities as well. Maybe I'm a once over and I'm a visitor. So really understanding that what works in one place may not work in the next is important. The resources may be different, certainly, but that you're going to build something that's tailored to that community. And then you want that to be as strong as possible.
Thanks for that, Jenna. We have one last question, and it goes towards equity and talking about policies and enforcement, though it's a little bit of a different arena. So current smoke-free policies and enforcement do not always cover individuals and families in single unit homes. Are these policies in its core promoting inequality since they're mostly focused on multi-unit housing? Thinking about the likes of former California governor that pushed for exemptions in Beverly Hills smoke-free policies. Jamie?
Yeah, happy to take a first crack at this. So there is an interaction between smoke-free outdoor air policies and smoke-free multi-unit housing policies, and that is thinking about where smoking or tobacco use should be permitted. And that is a discussion that each jurisdiction should have, and some may have one policy but not the other. Some may be trying to adopt both at the same time, but it does interact when you're thinking about, for example, if you have a smoke-free sidewalk policy and you have a smoke-free multi-unit housing policy, then that would be on the much more restrictive side and could result in there not being a legal place for somebody to smoke within their immediate vicinity of their building. So would that mean that in your jurisdiction, you'd want a designated smoking area policy within your multi-unit housing? Those might be things that you want to consider. For the single family housing, I'm not aware of a jurisdiction that has outlawed smoking within single family housing. In the multi-housing context, and we'll have a separate webinar on this coming up, there is some discussion about, for example, carriage houses, ADUs, how do you deal with rentals on the property? And we can talk about that. There is also some discussion sometimes about smoking in your backyard. Is that outdoors? How does that count? There are some buffer policies sometimes in outdoor air policies around playgrounds or other areas, and but oftentimes jurisdictions will include an exemption for single family homes, including for their yards. So those are policy choices for the individual jurisdiction and what they're comfortable with enforcing on their residents, what their residents would be willing to support. But certainly it is worth thinking about how smoke-free outdoor air policy, smoke-free multi-unit housing, and even smoke-free workplaces would interact. Jenna, what did I miss?
I'm focused on the line in here that says, are these policies in its core promoting inequality since they are mostly focused on multi-unit housing? And I want to say you have a point. However, when we think about the tobacco laws we passed, we think about how tobacco interacts with people as it not just affects the user. We definitely have policies and resources for the user, but how it affects everybody else. And the difference between a single family home, or maybe just one individual lives there and smokes, and a multi-unit dwelling is that everybody in the multi-unit dwelling is affected by the smoker, by the smoking, by the product. And that's not always the case in single family homes. So I think I know there's an MUH call coming up, so where we're going to talk about what equitable enforcement in MUH looks like. But as much as I would love to say everybody's home should be smoke-free, our work is also multifaceted. So while we're also working on comprehensive smoke-free policies in our communities to create those social norms and expectations that smoking is just not an acceptable thing anymore, it's also important we're doing the tobacco retail work as we work to eliminate the sale of tobacco products like Beverly Hills and Manhattan Beach. There will be less a need and an expectation that people will allow smoking in their homes, whether it's single dwelling or multi-unit. Yeah, I don't think it's an equity. I think it's what makes most sense right now to the most people. That being said, we also do focus on single family homes when they're foster homes or daycare centers or within housing authorities. Also, condo associations, et cetera, can make their own rules. again, I think it's about moving everybody towards the goal of ultimately just having a tobacco-free life. So keep pushing on all the levers, I guess would be my advice.
Thank you, Jenna. And Jenna kind of hit on, and we're kind of getting to the close of our time. It's 1:58, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time for ending and wrapping up this presentation. But this webinar is a part of a series, and this is the first part of the series, which is Outdoor Model Ordinance, Smoke-Free Outdoor Model Ordinance. Part 2 is going to be happening on October 18th, and this will just be a series continuing on Tuesdays. So block off your Tuesdays. But part 2 is October 18th, which is Equitable Enforcement for Tobacco Retail License Ordinances. And then the Tuesday after that, which is October 25th, which is part 3, which is Equitable Enforcement for Smoke-Free Multi-Unit Housing Ordinances. So we're going to be getting more into the conversation and those topics that both Jamie and Jenna just talked about regarding the question that just came in. So I just want to take the time to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you so much for Jamie and Jenna for answering questions and Jamie for presenting. We hope everyone has a good rest of your week, and thank you for attending so much.